Let's ride. Let's ride. Welcome to the Showdown Breakdown with myself, Drew Dinkmeyer, and Cody Main. I am in the host chair today in place of Adam Levitan, who undoubtedly is out in the mountains of Colorado doing ayahuasca with Andrew Wiggins. To join me to break down this wonderful Showdown slate, the Denver Broncos, the Indianapolis Colts with no starting running backs, is my man Cody Main. Cody, how are you on this fine Thursday?
I'm good. I'm sick of Russ at this point. It's been 3 primetime Showdown slates to start the season in week 5. I mean, come on, it's enough already with Russ, but there's money to be made tonight. So I'm ready to dive into it regardless.
Yeah. Get your Subway sandwich, sit down, start making some Showdown lineups and get to it. We've got a 42 total, a 3.5 point favorite here at home for Denver. And immediately, Cody, when I was looking at the slate, all I could think of was how excited you would be to talk about kickers and defenses. So let's get into the macro breakdown. What do you do on these lower scoring or expected lower scoring slates where it's tough to conjure up any sort of confidence in either offense?
Yeah, and I think that's the way the field's going to play it, right? And this is what we always talk about on these slates. 42-point total, 2 offenses that really no one is excited about. There are some interesting pieces at various price points today, just because of the injury stuff that we're having to deal with. But I think most people are out on both quarterbacks. Most people are out on both coaching staffs at this point. So we're going to see that heavily played. And the time to play DST and kicker to a lesser extent is when they're not going to be played, because we're very poor at projecting their score, or very poor at projecting their DraftKings scoring. We're much better at projecting their ownership. So when they're going to be highly owned, when they're going to be used often and often together, is usually the time to get away from it. But we're going to have to talk through some offensive decision points today, because it's going to be difficult to get excited about lineups that kind of steer away from that expected poor score and don't roster the DSTs and kickers, because Matt Ryan at this point now is just apparently a turnover machine. So I'm nervous about what I expect to be not a full fade, but an underweight position on the Broncos defense tonight.
Yeah, I think this is a difficult slate to play in general because of a number of different pieces. One being the loss of high-end running back options with no Jonathan Taylor and no Javonte Williams. Obviously, it shifts a lot of workload. It shifts a lot of opportunity, but it's also going to shift a lot of ownership. And it seems like a slate where there's almost too much value, and it's naturally popping up Russ and Cortland Sutton as the two guys people are like reasonably okay with paying for. And so they're going to get very highly utilized by the field. And then like building lineups, you could see a game environment, honestly, where like leaving a ton of salary ends up being optimal as well. So in terms of trying to be unique into a slate that defense and kicker are going to be somewhat dominant, how do things get adjusted for you in terms of your approach with the lack of high-end options on the slate pricing wise?
Yeah, and as I was writing this slate up, I kept thinking, man, Michael Pittman is a little bit too expensive. Michael Pittman's, $400 cheaper than Jonathan Taylor. I think he might be the guy that ends up getting squeezed, but you have all the money in the world tonight. When we go through and start to project ownership and kind of see where that gives us in terms of like a median salary spent, like usually we get pretty close to that 50K cap because people want to spend up for the most popular options. But you have guys that are, almost stone minimum on today's slate or slightly above that project better than some of the guys that are 4 and 5K. And so I think that is going to push a lot of people towards that stars and scrubs approach where you jam in Sutton, Russ, etc., and then go down there, even Pittman to a degree, who doesn't project nearly as well as those guys from a base perspective, and go down to the cheap guys that are popping as value now that we have all the injury news in. So I think one way just from the start is just to kind of flip the script and look at this, 8, 6, 7K range here and see if we can find some guys that might have some ceiling to match or exceed those guys that are a little bit more expensive, and then just hope that the really cheap guys end up failing is one way to get different, I think. But I always get this question: how much salary is too much salary to leave on the table? I was building lineups earlier today that were like 46K, so you can get pretty comfortable leaving a lot of money on the table tonight, I think.
Yeah, and then on the roster construction side of things, it looks to me, obviously the 1-5s are going to be very underutilized. Indy is a tough offense to get excited about just generally. The good news about Indy is the pricing is really affordable. The question is, can they even, what are the scenarios that they even support 5 guys on their side, right? It's probably got to include Matt Ryan throwing multiple touchdowns. in those scenarios. So I might lean into, if I was looking at any 5-1s, certainly making sure that I had a lot of Matt Ryan in those builds. Whereas if I'm looking at 5-1s on the Broncos side of things, which are going to be utilized, we're projecting around 11% of the field. Those are the lineups that when we're talking about leaning away from Denver defense, those are the lineups I would include Denver defense in, is when I'm using the 5-1. So almost all of my Denver defense exposure would be through those 5-1s tonight.
Totally agree. And to take the 5-1 point even further, like 11.4% for a 5-1 in this type of game environment. We got Denver as 3.5-point home favorites, and Indy's offense is a bit rough out of the jump. So, and I know Denver's has been too, but talk about using the defense in those type of builds. I love that. And then not having the cheap guy as the cheap Indy as your one in the bring back. Cause I think that's going to be so popular. Have guys like Mo Ali Cox, obviously Philip Lindsay down there at the bottom. Nyheim Hines will be a popular bring back. So you can get even more unique within those 5-1s by just maybe you play a 5-1 and you bring it back with somebody like Pittman, which will, ultimately probably get you off of, someone like Sutton or Russ. So I think flipping the script within a 5-1 is a sharp way to play tonight, if you think Denver does kind of go out and dominate a little bit.
That's the scenario that you can win with that lineup, right? Low scoring, but domination, right? So like a scenario where, let's say it's like, I remember one of the games that we tend to reference is like a 19-3 game, something like that, right? Where the Colts just cannot score points, but Pittman goes out there and goes like 10 for 85. And all of a sudden, like that 18 is commensurate with the top end options. Let's say it's like a field goal fest for McManus and Russ isn't scoring touchdowns. Those are these kind of weird lineups that you can get unique builds. So I know sometimes with these like low total games, it feels harder to build because you necessarily want to lean into some of the things that the field is going to do, like in kickers and defense, you get inclined to do that. But I actually think you can get even weirder, because if it really is low scoring and it takes touchdown production off the table, you can start to remove quarterbacks off the table. And then you're just betting on like, what if there's target volume that's concentrated on one or two guys, and then you just get weird with another guy, like a 3 for 40 for another guy could end up winning it. So I think these builds are somewhat interesting in terms of like, you can find stuff that really avoids dupes in a big way.
Yeah, I agree. And on the quarterback side of things, we just saw the last slate with Jimmy coming in pretty low owned, with Matthew Stafford coming in really low owned as well. And we saw a Captain Cooper Cup lineup without his quarterback win alongside Tyler Higbee. And if you have that condensed target share on a slate like this, you can see something like that happening if the offenses struggle to get in the end zone. So I kind of like that. And I think that ownership on the quarterbacks is going to be inflated here just because of the state of the slate, right? I mean, I know people aren't excited about Matt Ryan. I know people aren't excited about Russell Wilson, but you have to spend the money somewhere. And the base projections, given the other options around them, aren't all that bad.
So let's talk through the captain or the quarterback position in terms of captain. I know it's a position that generally you like to avoid using in the captain spot. And when you are using quarterbacks in the captain spot, they're usually ones that have some sort of rushing component to them. Here we are with Matt Ryan, who has no rushing component to him whatsoever. Not going to have very much captain ownership at all. But really the only scenario that I think a captain Matt Ryan hits is if he throws 3 touchdowns to 3 different guys, right? So like, are you going to X out Matt Ryan captain from your builds?
Yeah, I think I am, and I don't want to fully tout that to anybody that is interested in the Matt Ryan stuff. But I would say that if you are interested in Matt Ryan captain for your own lineups, Drew's point is exactly what you need to happen. Even if you want to pair him with 2 guys, given the way that he's going to score and given the way that the wide receivers are going to score on DraftKings, where it is PPR friendly, of course. Like one of those guys is just going to outscore him if it's just 2 guys. So I'm taking that a step further. If I was playing Matt Ryan at captain, I would be pairing him with 3 receivers tonight and just hoping that it is totally distributed. They find the end zone 3 times, and each guy gets 1 touchdown.
Yeah, I almost think the only Matt Ryan builds, I mean, obviously 4-2 in that scenario could potentially work, but I almost think I'd only include him in captain in a 5-1 build on Indy side. And like, then you're like super, super contrarian. But I agree with you. I think it's a min 3 skill player pairing. I would include, usually we do just wide receiver, tight end and that stuff. I would include Nyheim Hines in that stuff.
Agreed.
Just because of the pass catching role that he's had over the years. On the Russell Wilson side, 15% captain ownership, I think, is getting inflated just because of the lack of options on this slate. So how do you feel about Russell Wilson as a captain option?
And this is one where I could see it coming in, getting steamed up to 17, 18, 19, 20% because he has the highest projection on the slate. And you have all the money in the world to fit him in there. So anyone playing large field stuff where optimizers will be prevalent, you're going to see that ownership likely come up. Even small field stuff, I think that's just the most comfortable place to start, and then start to build around that with the wide receiver options that they have and the running back value. I think I'm out in my my smaller field single entry stuff. I think I'll be out on Russ. If I'm building a 150 portfolio tonight, I will certainly have some exposure, but would be cognizant of how I'm building around that as well, because I think it will be popular. And I still want to, in a Russell Wilson captain lineup, I still want two Denver pass catchers. And I think you could probably include Mike Boone in that, but there are ways to get different because you have some of these options further down the board in the Denver pass catching core, with Eric Saubert now having a role with like Kendall Hinton and possibly KJ Hamler. You have plenty of options to get unique. So I think in those type of lineups, you're going to see a lot of Cortland Sutton. You're going to see a lot of Jerry Jeudy, and a lot of them together. Going a little bit further down the board is probably the way to play Russ captain to be unique.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. So if Russ captain, maybe max one of Jeudy Sutton to ensure more uniqueness on a slate that, we're assuming people are going to condense their builds just because the fewer options that there are. So naturally you can dedupe a little bit by making rules kind of like that. Let's shift over to the running back position, which is really the talk in the fantasy world about, this game is trying to figure out. I know Levitan, is literally out in the mountains doing ayahuasca because Mike Boone's getting an opportunity. This is his moment. Like he wants to be in another realm, another planet, to enjoy Mike Boone on Thursday Night Football all to himself. He's a popular waiver wire pickup in season long. Deion Jackson is a guy that people were excited about on the prospect profile side for Indianapolis, but we assume Nyheim Hines is going to get that role, with Philip Lindsay getting a hometown role here. How are you handling the running back position, and especially the Philip Lindsay stuff? Because basically Denver, as you noted in the article, Denver was priced appropriately for Javonte Williams' injury, but Indy was not for Jonathan Taylor's injury. So you've got this Indy discount, and Philip Lindsay is just remarkably cheap, but not that crazy owned, because how do you fill out the salary? And if people are using minimum salary constraints, they might not even get as much Philip Lindsay as they should.
That's the most interesting component of this whole thing. He's 400. He has an 8.3 base projection, and any optimizer, if you're not setting min constraints, or any optimizer in general, is going to want to force that into lineups to get those guys, the guys that are more expensive in there. But we just see the field kind of have an aversion to this stuff, at least up to some point. We won't see any sort of floor ownership on Philip Lindsay, but I don't know if it'll get up to the 40% or even more that maybe his base projection and price would suggest. We had not a 1-for-1 situation, but I think it was 2020 or maybe 2021 where Debo was coming back from an injury and just happened to be min priced because he started the week on IR and had a full Debo role based off projection, based off of market sentiment, was coming back into a full-time role and only got up to 39%. So a min price Debo Samuel from a year or two ago coming off IR, was 39% owned. I think that's probably Lindsay's ceiling here on his ownership. But there's so much input volatility here that I think you'll see, people that are hand building have question marks and not want to click it. I think you'll see opto bros want to cap it because they're going to get so much of it. So I think it's going to come in reasonably based off of how it projects. But I am nervous because this projection really isn't based off of any logic other than kind of some assumptions that we're making about him being activated from the practice squad and taking a bit more of the base work role. But it wouldn't shock me if Deion Jackson came out and was just the RB2 behind Nyheim Hines. We just don't know.
Yeah, it's a tricky spot. The coaching staff has noted that Lindsay's going to get opportunities, so you have to feel pretty good. And Nyheim Hines he's not a bulk running back to take a huge workload. So I think Nyheim Hines' role shifts slightly. I think he probably gets 5 more carries or something like that, but it's not like he's getting 10 more carries in these options. And I think in general, they're just going to lean a little bit more pass heavier to accommodate the loss of Jonathan Taylor. In terms of the split between Melvin Gordon and Mike Boone, I've been eavesdropping in the props channel, the projections channel all week to see kind of what the team was coming up with. And, we don't have them projected too far apart here. 14.4 points for Melvin Gordon, 11.5 for Mike Boone. The ownership is going to be about half for Mike Boone is what we're projecting compared to Melvin Gordon. How are you approaching the Broncos running back situation tonight?
It seems like Mike Boone might be in line for like the more PPR friendly role. I know that could certainly shift now with Javonte out, and Melvin could just take the feature back role, as the offensive coordinator kind of alluded to reporters on Tuesday. He said he would be the feature back, would obviously get the RB1 role there. But like Mike Boone had been getting used in obvious passing situations, even when Javonte Williams was healthy. So now with Javonte Williams out, you have the Melvin Gordon neck injury. I know he's fully removed from the injury report. You have the Melvin Gordon fumble stuff. I don't think that a coaching staff is going to just ditch their veteran because of a couple of fumbles. But, I guess my question would be, I have interest in both. Like, can they both get there in the same lineup? Because I think that's one way to get unique and playing into a 50% owned Melvin Gordon, who I think, has a good role with Javonte out, but can they both get there together? And will that be a way to get unique on this slate?
And I think they could. I think in these low scoring slates, it's weird. It's kind of like in really low scoring slates or really high scoring slates, I think there's paths for like both running backs to get there on the same team. In the mids, in like the 27-20 games, it's probably harder. But in this scenario, like there's a possibility that the Broncos only score 3 touchdowns and those guys, gobble up 2 of them. So I think you definitely can pair them together. I do think Boone makes more sense paired with Russ if you're going the direction of playing one of the running backs with Russ, just because we've seen a little bit more on the pass catching side of things. And it's sort of a natural fade on Melvin Gordon. I would expect Melvin Gordon to have all of the goal line work. So if Melvin Gordon is not scoring TDs and Denver's offense is scoring TDs, then it's through Russ or Mike Boone. Like, it's kind of natural leverage there. So I'd consider Boone a little bit more bumped up with Russell Wilson there. And then Lindsey and Hines, you could even play together, I think, because of the price tags associated with them. It gets into builds that are probably going to leave some money on the table, probably going to be a little bit more contrarian in nature. But I think you can do that too in scenarios where, they're effective on the ground and the pass volume is condensed down to, or the pass volume is lighter. So Matt Ryan only attempts like 25 passes. Hines catches 6 balls. Philip Lindsay's effective on the ground and scores a touchdown. There's a scenario where they're the 2 Colts that you end up needing in the lineup. So I think you can play them together as well.
Yeah, I do agree. Do you think Nyheim Hines gets like the high leverage carries, like near the goal line in the red zone? Do you think he gets those rushing attempts, or do you think like if Philip Lindsay's on the field, they just roll with Philip Lindsay?
Lindsay's not that big, so I think they're going to trust Hines. And there's been enough times basically early on in Jonathan Taylor's career where it was very frustrating, where Hines, if he was just on the field, he'd kind of stay in around the goal line and they'd be comfortable rushing him into stuff. And then Taylor broke out the second half of last season and they kind of cut all that. So I think there's definitely like if I had to bet, I would bet on the first high leverage, short down and distance carry going to Nyheim Hines.
I'm with you. Yeah. And I think, it just takes so little for Lindsay to get there. The way that he fails is just he's inefficient on the ground and doesn't get those high leverage carries or just doesn't convert on them. But, $400, we pray for these guys in Showdown and it's finally here. I just hope it doesn't get too owned because the base projection is just really hard to get away from.
Yeah, I don't think it will get too owned, largely because I think it's just because of the salary nature of this slate. Like, if this Philip Lindsay play was in the Bucks Chiefs game we had last week, it would be 40-50% owned because you just are dying to get the salary relief to fit everybody else in. On this slate, you don't really need it a ton. Like, there's obviously plenty of ways you can differentiate. So I think he's going to be pretty limited in terms of the ownership there. Let's go to wide receiver. The big distinction, and you noted this like right off the bat, is there's this huge gap in projected ownership between Courtland Sutton and Michael Pittman, the favored wide receiver who has shown and flashed a little bit more ceiling, but the guy who is going after Michael Pittman in season-long drafts in a scenario where in season-long drafts, we were expecting Denver's offense to be much more high-powered than this. And it's disappointed. And Sutton was still going behind Pittman there, and he's going to be almost twice the ownership is what we're expecting tonight from a captain perspective and from a total ownership perspective because of that price gap between the two. The projected gap is, decent, a few points, but in Showdown, that's really nothing to overcome. So Pittman looks like one of the strongest leverage plays on the slate.
Yeah, agreed. And if he's going to come in, lower owned than Jerry Jeudy at captain, going to come in half or even more as owned at captain than, Cortland Sutton, I think that's a place to just embrace some of that volatility. He was week 1 main slate chalk and went out and smashed, was injured in week 2, and then has kind of struggled in weeks 3 and 4. Now, it doesn't seem like it should be all that surprising for him to have kind of these up and down weeks if we're going to get this version of Matt Ryan, but he's still the alpha in this offense, and to see like a true wide receiver 1 type ceiling from him would not be that surprising at all. As I'm thinking through this more, like I am a little bit worried that that's just going to come up naturally because it has to, because of, his base projection isn't good for his price tag, but the price tag almost doesn't matter in this point. So I think that the ownership could come up, if anything, which has me slightly worried.
I think in a weird way, his ownership is somewhat tied to Philip Lindsay. So if Lindsay gets owned really heavily, it's probably going to be funneling Pittman up as well as the salary filler there, right? Because like what happens in those builds is it gets away from the Alec Pierces, from these like the Paris Campbells, the like mid-tier secondary guys. It gets away from them and just condenses, and that would be my one concern on this side of things. Let's talk about Alec Pierce though, because you noted in the Showdown breakdown the target share has been increasing. The way that he is expected to score points, he's a bigger receiver who is expected to be used more around the red zone and on deep plays. Like they would come in bunches. So even though he's in this receiver rotation with Paris Campbell and Ashton Doolin, there are some signs that suggest, things are moving in a positive direction for the rookie.
It is frustrating that he can't seem to like get on the field more. They're not willing to get him on the field more, despite how well he has been or how good he has been at earning targets. But 47% route participation in week 3, 40% in week 4. Like it just seems like he's a 50% player. But we're going to get paid off with extremely low ownership on this slate, and it's going to force us into kind of a unique build, I think, if we don't want to play that $400 Philip Lindsay. He is going to score in bunches. I think that's the way that this team wants to use him, and that's kind of his profile as a wide receiver. It's just something that I'm always willing to embrace, that volatility when it's going to be paired with low ownership. There are plenty of zeros and plenty of like 2 for 40s in his range of outcomes, but there's also those where those 2 catches go for touchdowns as well, or he just ends up getting more work. I mean, at some point this team has to realize what they have with Paris Campbell and stop giving him 80% of the team's routes and fully embrace some of that Alec Pierce stuff. So maybe there is some part of his outcome where he ends up playing more, but I'm really not playing it for that. I'm just playing it for his ability to earn targets and for those targets to be high value.
And I think there's pretty much no scenario that Pierce, Campbell, or Doolin get steamed. Like I can't see. I mean, it would have to be like Pittman gets ruled out surprisingly late or something like that. But I mean, these guys, because it's a wide receiver rotation, because the production is really inconsistent, because it's on the underdog team that nobody wants to play the quarterback with, like there is a real ownership ceiling on all of these guys. And so I think immediately, if you get into any of these 3 guys, you're immediately eliminating a decent bit of dupes from the main kind of builds. I just don't think they're going to be owned by the field at all.
And I think I'm in on like a negative boost. Would you negative boost on Pittman if Pierce is in my lineup, just because of like I said, the way that he scores, and then you also have Pittman's still got to do something to get in the winning lineup. Would you just completely eliminate Campbell and Doolin in lineups where Pierce is in?
So I'd max 2 of Pierce, Campbell, Doolin. I think there's a scenario where there's like 2 random touchdowns, and in a game that doesn't have a lot of touchdowns, they each go to those guys, and that could end up be the winner. There's also in-game injury scenarios where like Pittman gets a concussion or something like that, and then these guys are out there. But I don't see any way that all 3. So I would definitely max 2, and I might max 2 in builds without Matt Ryan. I might max 2 Colts receiver options just generally. I think you could get to 3 with a tight end, but like, man, 3 wide receivers, like you need to have Matt Ryan almost in the captain in that spot, or Matt Ryan included in the lineup. So I would create a lot of rules around this receiver rotation for sure.
Makes sense.
On the Denver side of things, we thought it was going to be KJ Hamler kind of coming into the season, operating in that 3rd role once Tim Patrick went down. It has not been. It's been Kendall Hinton who's taken on that role. He's only $1,000. And so he's another guy like Philip Lindsay that just is very, very cheap, very affordable, and kind of stands out from a projection standpoint relative to the other cheap options. Do you expect Hinton to to be like, where do you expect Hinton and Lindsey's ownership combined to fall?
And that's why I get into this, like where these mid-tier and balanced builds are going to be so low owned, because if it's not Lindsey, it's going to be Hinton. Hinton projects better than guys that are $2,600, $3,600, $4,000 more expensive than him. And we haven't even gotten to Eric Saubert yet. So we have plenty of cheap options on this slate. And like I said, these are like plays that we're starving for on slates like Tampa Bay, KC, and they're just, they're totally playable. So I think, 40 to 50% total ownership, maybe 55% is probably the ceiling. Like, I think if one of them gets steamed, it might just end up coming a little bit from one of the other ones, because you just can't play them together. But if you told me it was 20 and 25 or 20 and 30, somewhere in that range, I would not be surprised at all. And that's why you're going to see a lot of these builds just jam in those two or one of those two, and then just funnel all the way up to the top. So I like Hinton. And I think there was some, like, he has to be like activated to the roster because he's been called up 3 times. So like, he has to actually be signed to the active roster, I believe, which it seems like he is, or maybe he already has been, and I just missed it. But I mean, yeah, $1,000 for the wide receiver 3 in this version of the offense isn't as good as we thought it would be coming into the season, but it's still a really strong base role.
I'm just waiting for them to run a trick play with him throwing the ball too, given his vast quarterback experience that we saw last year during the COVID outbreak. In terms of other wide receiver options, Hamler, he's just not on the field. He's not getting opportunities, but like, he is the type of guy that I like was built for contrarian showdown lineups, in terms of like, gets one deep ball. That's all you need. Like, it might not be enough on a main slate to win anything, but on a showdown slate, it would be enough. Will you have any KJ Hamler at this 2.6% projected ownership tonight?
I think he's going to miss. He might miss the player pool. He did get the one deep ball last week. He went 1 for 55 on like 8% of the team snaps. And if he ended up in the end zone on that one deep ball, he probably would have been in an optimal showdown lineup. 4,400, like the way I always talk through this, it's contrarian, and like, he can get there on minimal work, but at 4,400, like, he's still got to do something. And I know salary is less important on this slate, but it's like 1 for 55 probably doesn't do it. He does need to go like 1 for 55 and a touchdown, which
it's got to find the end zone.
He's got to find the end zone. And like, the more I think about it, if I'm just betting on that, why would I not just bet like an anytime touchdown prop? I'm sure I'm getting paid off with worse odds, but like, I rostered the KJ Hamler at 2.6% owned and then still don't ship the showdown slate because I didn't get everything else right around it. Why not just go bet the touchdown prop?
Yeah, shout out Penn State in Levitan's absence here. Let's go to the tight ends, where, again, the slate, like, it seems like each position, I'm like, oh, it can't get more interesting, but it keeps getting more interesting because you've got tight end rotations abound. With the Colts, we finally saw, PSM champion Mo Alley-Cox after PSM runner-up Jelani Woods the week before. Kylan Granson is in the mix as well. They're just very comfortable rotating the tight ends. Alley-Cox scored twice last week. I assume that's going to draw more of the interest, even with the elevated salary, because he was the guy in preseason people had ranked above the group, and you get the slightest glimmer of that scenario playing out, and people are like, yep, that's the thing. Let's move forward with it. So Mo Alley-Cox, while I think he should be getting the bulk of the role and the bulk of the opportunities, and I normally would think like, okay, this is the guy to play, I think some of the other Colts tight ends are probably better plays relative to ownership tonight.
Yeah, and it depends on like how much of an ownership discount are we really going to get paid off with here, and if it's significant, then that's where I want to go. I think there's a lot of reasons why the field will talk themselves into Mo Alley-Cox. Evan hit on a couple of them in his article. The routes have been up in 4 consecutive weeks. He just hit pay dirt twice last week. I think the field will talk themselves into going there a little bit more, and where the salary discount doesn't matter, I think you could see that happening even a little bit more. So Kylan Granson, we have 10% projected. It doesn't seem like that is a position where it's ever going to get over that 10%, given his projection and his price tag. And then Jelani Woods even further. He's 2,200. Base projection isn't great, but the fact that you just need a guy to fall in the end zone at that point at 1% kind of keeps him in play. So I don't know how
we saw him score twice a couple weeks ago. So like, it's not It's not out of the realm. I don't mind mixing these guys in. I also will take the over on the current Mo Alley-Cox projected ownership. I think he comes in higher than Alec Pierce. I think he is going to be. I think he is going to be viewed as because of the recency of the scoring 2 touchdowns and basically a similar salary. I just think people are going to be on Mo Alley-Cox above Pierce, which is one of the reasons I like Pierce quite a bit. One of the reasons I don't mind getting away from Mo Alley-Cox tonight, even with the dominance in the PSM model. On Denver side, Albert Zero, formerly known as Albert O, did play 1 snap last week. What the hell do we do with the Broncos tight ends, Cody?
This Eric Saubert role is like insane for a $1,200 price tight end on Showdown. We know tight ends always break Showdown slates, so it's just a given that one of these guys is going to score. It's just figuring out which one it's going to be. But like, he's running or getting targeted deep downfield. I haven't been team watch the tape, so I don't know why he's getting targeted deep downfield. But he has like the team's 3rd highest ADOT. He's going to get targeted in the red zone and near the goal line. And this team, just like at this point, seems to want to bridge the gap from Albert O to Greg Dulcich, and they're just like, we don't want Albert O in his 0 in the run blocking game on the field anymore. So we're going to put Eric Saubert out there, and in a week or 2, when Greg Dulcich is healthy, then Greg Dulcich will take over, and we'll still use Eric Saubert a little bit. It just seems like they've soured on Okuibunam. So I'm kind of in on like this 83% route participation from last week being somewhat legit. I don't know if they fall behind, if they just completely oust Albert O from the offense, but this is where it's interesting because he is 1,200. The base projection is pretty strong for a normal Showdown slate, not for this particular one. But again, a situation where if you want to play the stars and scrubs style builds where you fit in some of those top guys, Philip Lindsay's going to be owned. We can assume that Kendall Hinton's going to be pretty owned. I don't think there's going to be any steam on 255-pound tight end who runs a 4.840. So it doesn't seem all that sexy with some of the other options on the slate. But if I want to get into these stars and scrubs builds, I like Eric Saubert as a way to get different.
Yeah, and Albert O would be the type of bet that I would make on a Showdown slate that is normally like really high scoring and he's really contrarian. It's just totally unnecessary on this slate. Like I would often be trying to find on a slate where there are a lot of pieces up top that I was interested in. I need salary relief. I need to be different. Like I'd be looking on betting on talent. I kind of do that frequently. I played a ton of Rashad White on that Bucks Chiefs Showdown slate with that kind of idea in mind. And Alberto would normally fit that, but this slate, it just isn't necessary. And you're not even like him being 4.6% owned. If that projection comes in right, that's like, we can get lower guys who played more than a snap last week. So,
right.
So as much as we want to think the talent is there, I can't get down with it. All right, let's go to D and kicker. On the D side of things, the Broncos are going to be fairly popular. We've seen Matt Ryan be very, very turnover prone. The Colts are going to have some popularity too, coming in at 15+%. I think the Colts defense is a bad play. I think the Broncos defense is justifiable in the right scenarios is kind of the way that I look at it. And that's particularly the 5-1 scenarios. That's my approach. What's yours to defense?
Such an important point to make is they are viable in the right scenarios. If you're playing into this chalky Broncos defense and hand raised, like historically my ownership model has just really struggled to accurately project DSTs. They frequently come in higher owned than my model thinks they should be or projects them to be, so that will tend to get inflated. I would not be surprised to see them push 25 or 30%, as that is just the route that the field chooses to go in this 4-ish K range. We just talked about Molly Cox and Alec Pierce and guys in this range. I think the field will be more comfortable with a defense facing, a Matt Ryan offense that has turned the ball over as many times as they have. Playing them in the right game scripts and in the right scenarios and roster constructions is the way that I want to do it. In 5-1s, defenses are just so much more likely to get there. And in those types of scripts where you're betting on there being 5 Broncos in the winning lineup, it's more likely that 5th Bronco is a DST than another skill position player. We've seen that play out pretty frequently. So I like playing the Broncos into that roster construction with a couple of skill position players and then the Denver defense to round it out.
Will you play any Colts, or would you only do it in like 5-1s or 4-2s? We know the Colts side is going to be tilted away when we project the roster utilization. So what's your take on the Colts team?
Yeah, and I don't think I'm gonna get to any 1.5s today. I can't talk myself into 1.5, even though it's 2.5% owner, 2.5% projected ownership on that style of roster. And I don't see scenarios where I'm playing them as like a one-off and a 4-2 or a 3-3 or anything like that. I just think there are better options. But I could see that coming back to bite me. But if I would just want to get paid off with a better ownership discount if I'm going there. And 15.
That's the thing for me. I feel like they should be 7 or 8%,
yes,
not 15, 16. And I think the nature of this game is just gravitating people there because they have enough money to spend up from the Hinton, Saubert, Lindsay's, and they look at the total and they're like, oh, okay, I'll play the Colts defense because it fits here. On the kicker side of things, one interesting note here is the game is in altitude in Denver. And so a couple things happen, right? Field goal distances are easier to achieve. So it's easier to hit 40, 50 yarders in altitude than it is not. And also teams are often willing to kick field goals more so in altitude than they might normally be in other conditions. That being said, we've got 20% projected ownership on each of the kickers tonight. Not typically a super exciting scenario for me, but one that I think you do need to consider given the lack of potential pass volume from the two offenses and the lack of scoring, where field goals could make an outsized percentage of the scoring tonight. What are your thoughts on the kickers?
Yeah, and the kicker success has like been so public, and again, shout out to Big T for hitting the captain kicker Graham Gano call. But it's true, like it's been so public that it's actually getting inflated. Like we saw Evan McPherson on that Bengals Dolphins.
Yep.
That he was 3.7% owned in the captain, and you never see anything like that. I've been tracking this for 3 years, and like 2.7 was the highest we had seen. So it is getting inflated this year, I think, just as a part of its overall success. The one interesting thing to note is like kickers can get there in any sort of game environment. I often talk about it in the breakdowns. Like if a team's going to go over its total, like the kicker is going to be involved. I think the field has generally underestimated how involved kickers are in teams going over its total. And especially in a game like this with altitude, but it's interesting that they can get there if the game scores 75 points and, because you've got the field goals and you've got all the extra points, but they can also get there in a game that's 19-3 because they're the only ones that score. So I have a little bit of interest. I've always struggled with like the proper way to build around them or which lineups they generally fit into. But typically, like if I'm heavy on a team's offense, I want to be less so on their kicker because you're kind of assuming a lot of scoring, a lot of touchdown scoring, which means less field goal opportunities for the kickers. So I haven't quite figured out the secret sauce there, but they're going to definitely make the pool. Just need to figure out the right way to get them into builds.
Yeah, some scenarios that I think about when I'm thinking about kicker selection is I often will negatively correlate a kicker with his same team quarterback and same team running back, right? Because those guys generally get a lot of their production via touchdowns, and that usually hurts the kicker in their upside because there's only so many scoring drives that teams are going to generate during the course of a game. So if you're getting 3 touchdowns from the quarterback and the running back, it's really hard for the kicker to be kind of in the winning lineup. I generally will play like kicker with opposing quarterback and different things like that. And I also think about the kicker in the context of how much reception volume I think there is during the course of a game. So for example, a team that like in Kansas City, right? Like we saw Matt Wright, who was like under-owned in that Tampa Bay Kansas City game, but you needed some sort of salary relief during that game to kind of figure it out. But a team that's going to complete 25 to 35 passes in a game, it's going to be hard for the kicker to win in those lineups. You need them to complete all those passes and not score touchdowns. So it gets into really weird builds. In games where there's going to be a ton of running or inefficient quarterbacks, when there's less reception volume, I think the kickers are more valuable. And I think that's the type of game environment we have tonight, especially in altitude, where some of these 40-yard kicks end up being 50-yard kicks and you get a full extra point on them. So I'm interested in the kickers tonight, even at this 20% ownership. I think they're totally unnecessary in the captain spot because I just don't think there's enough high profile, high ceiling options in terms of salary on the slate that you need that salary relief for them in the captain spot. So I would not play them in captain, but I would be considering using a kicker in my hand builds. I do think it's just a spot where some of these cheap guys like Salbert or whatever could catch, less than 3 balls for less than 30 yards. And now we're looking at one single kick from the kickers really can separate them, 150-yard field goal. And because I just don't think there's going to be a lot of reception volume. So I'm into the kickers even at 20% ownership tonight. Just wouldn't be using them in the captain spot personally.
Yeah, that's an important point to make, is we always talk through the lens of like who they need to beat. And on the slate, kind of the mid-tier that they're priced around is really ugly. It's the really cheap guys that we really need them to beat, and kind of just flip the construction a little bit if we're not wanting to play into that Phillip Lindsay, Kendall Hinton, Eric Saubert type stuff.
Yeah, and it can be beating them by the combination of them and another mid-tier guy outscoring the Sutton or Pittman and the cheap guy, right? So
Exactly.
There's a couple different ways that it can go. All right, Cody, we've reached that wonderful part of the show here, the flag plant. I will defer to you on the opening flag plants. I have full faith and confidence that this will not be a Kyle Rudolph-esque flag plant. So
I got laughed off the stream when I did that. Unbelievable.
The Will Dissly redeemed you, my man.
The Will Dissly redemption.
But I was fist pumping on a plane when Will Dissly was scoring, noting that Cody had gotten his revenge on all of us.
That was an all-time. I am always into flag planting dad runners. That is one thing I will always do. Not today though. Not today. I like this Indianapolis passing attack. I think they will funnel more pass happy in this game as 3.5 point underdogs without Jonathan Taylor. I think it's a little bit easier potentially to attack this Broncos team through the air at certain spots. I don't feel all that confident about their wide receivers, but one guy that I do want to bet on, who I think is a talent, who I think has shown an ability over the course of the first couple of weeks of his career to earn targets, is Alec Pierce. And I know he's probably a 50, maybe 60% player at max, because they're going to work in Paris Campbell and Ashton Dulin. But I'm all about betting on talent. I think the way that he earns targets and the way that he is targeted further down the field sets up for an opportunity to cash in on a couple of those targets at 15% ownership. I like Alec Pierce to finish in the winning lineup tonight.
Love it. I think it's a really strong play. As I noted, I think he'll come in under-owned relative to Mo Alley Cox. He's a little bit more expensive. Mo Alley Cox has the recent performance. If you can afford that extra salary, I'd rather play Pierce than Cox tonight. I think the ownership will come at a discount, even though we have it projected similarly. I think it's going to get stretched. I think Pierce is going to come down a little bit and Mo Alley Cox go up a little bit. All right, I am sitting in the host chair for Adam Levitan, and I'm going to make a flag plant in place of Adam Levitan. This guy has been calling for the freedom of Mike Boone for 3 years, from preseason time, from Minnesota Vikings time. This is the moment, and I cannot believe Levitan is not here. The one show he takes off the entire year is the free Mike Boone show. I will not let it go unnoticed. I will flag plant Mike Boone captain. What's gonna take things down tonight? He's going to get there with a receiving touchdown. So it's not going to be the rushing touchdown. You could still consider playing Melvin alongside him, but Mike Boone's getting in the end zone via the air, and he is in the winning lineup tonight. Shout out to Adam Levitan. All right, that'll do it for myself and Cody. Good luck tonight. Enjoy the Denver, Indiana game, and we'll be back on Sunday for another edition of Establish the Run's Showdown show.